In this debate, CTV kept screaming about Justin Trudeau as a communist, and his seizing of power with the Emergencies Act, and ooh, the Emergencies Act is so evil and stuff. Let me ramble about that for a moment. The Emergencies Act was, I think, very, very sketchy. Just gonna put that on the table. I do not like the Emergencies Act. It is not something that he wrote. It isn't something that the current Liberal government wrote. This is something that has been on the books for a long time, and I believe it was essentially a replacement of the previous. Let's do some googling so that we can talk smart about all this. Canada Emergencies Act. So the news stories will be, yeah, we have one. I want to see if there's like, yeah, Wikipedia. This it seems weird that I'd be like, let's go to the Wikipedia instead of the government of Canada, but I want to see some of the sort of histories behind it. So Emergencies Act passed by the Parliament of Canada in 1988. Let's just quickly go Canada government 1988, just so we know who was in power at the time. And apparently I can't type things. So probably pre this election. So this was Brian Mulroney, a conservative, was the prime minister at the time, the guy who brought us GST. And he won. So he was the incumbent, and he won the election for the PC Party to a second majority government. So this was the Emergencies Act was passed in Parliament during a majority conservative government. Probably worth understanding. Authorizes the federal government to take extraordinary temporary measures to respond to public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, the international emergencies, and war emergencies. This law replaces the War Measures Act passed in 1914. It asserts that any government action continues to be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Bill of Rights. Kind of a big deal. So, yeah, the War Measures Act, which I believe the last time it was used was by Trudeau the Senior, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who, as a child, I learned that the way they named Petro-Canada wasn't about petrochemicals. It was Pierre Elliott Trudeau rips off Canada. Waka waka. Anyways, so the War Measures Act has been around since the World War One times, and this is a replacement passed in 1988, which probably, if I dug into this, I'm fairly certain that what this is doing is basically making the War Measures Act more modern, but essentially the same thing. When Trudeau the Senior enacted the War Measures Act, it was during the FLQ crisis, which was a separatist party in France that was trying to essentially do all the things that Wexit wants, but they were terroristing, and they did some real good terrorisming, and so Trudeau rolled in tanks to Montreal. Not a popular move, at least in Montreal. Definitely not a popular move, but ended the problem. So under the Emergencies Act, the federal cabinet can declare a national emergency in response to an urgent and critical situation that cannot be dealt with by any existing law and either is beyond the capability of a province to deal with or threatens the sovereignty of Canada. Before declaring a national emergency, the federal cabinet must consult with provincial cabinets. In the case of public welfare or public order emergency, where the effects of the emergency are confined to or occur principally in one province, the Emergencies Act cannot be used if the provincial cabinet does not indicate that the situation is beyond the capacity of the province to deal with. Once an emergency is declared, it is subject to confirmation by the House of Commons and Senate. So here's the thing. Here's how this works. This cannot be cruel, cruel Justin Trudeau deciding to wield uncontrollable excess power and just deciding and giving himself superpowers, and we're all just left to deal with it. That's not the way the law is written, and that's not the way that it was used. He had to go to the provinces that were involved, which would be a lot more than just Ontario. But Ontario was certainly I almost said premier, but that's going to sound like premier. Was the hotbed of a lot of the attention. But like Coots in Alberta, and there were similar protests like across the fucking country. So it wasn't a single incident where he would need to necessarily have permission from Ottawa, but sorry, from the Ontario government. But I believe he did consult and stuff. Who knows? I wasn't there. Once an emergency is declared, it's subject to confirmation by the House of Commons and the Senate. So, in other words, he can say that and go, yeah, I've done all my due diligence, checked all the boxes, and we have an emergency and we need to deal. And he can implement that, but it has to be agreed to after the fact. So the Senate and the House of Commons can actually shut it down. And that's an interesting thing because the House of Commons is our elected body and the Senate is our fake elected body. And by that I mean they're appointed, they've always been appointed, and somewhere along the line conservatives were like, we should be able to have elections for Senate. I think it was based on, like, the Senate has always been a shit, just a mess. A lot of prime ministers, after their tour of office is done, will just sort of dump all of the people that they liked from their party into Senate positions, which are appointed and are sort of for life. So you can wind up in a situation. I think actually Trudeau the senior did this, where he basically like flooded the Senate with liberals, which I think is a shitty thing. And there should be, like, we should probably reform how the Senate is populated, but they have like legitimate, on our last election, which was not terribly long ago, they have a section for voting for your senator, which is hilarious because the government doesn't have to listen. And I don't think ever has. So, that's cool that we spend the money to make a special sheet of paper with all of the names of the people running for Senate, and then people will vote. I personally voted for Chad Thunders from the CJSW, which is a university radio station. He was their program director for a long time, and his whole candidacy was like, this is stupid. This is not an elected position. Fine, elect me to a non-elected position that no one will give me. Anyways, so there was a big kerfuffle about the Emergencies Act and what it does and what it doesn't do, and that Trudeau created this law in some way. No. That this was the first time it's ever been used. Yes, technically, but the War Measures Act was used. And if we look, I'm sure we can find examples of the War Measures Act being used. Provided for the declaration of war, invasion, or insurrection, and the types of emergency measures that could be taken. The act was brought into force 3 times in Canadian history during the First World War, Second World War, and the 1970 October Crisis. This is the FLQ thing that I was talking about. Refers to a chain of events that started in October 1970 when members of the Front de Libération de Québec, FLQ, kidnapped the provincial deputy premier Pierre Laporte and British diplomat James Cross from his Montreal residence. These events saw the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoking the War Measures Act for the first time in Canadian history during peacetime. I don't know why conservatives missed this in their arguing about how evil just and when Bush the Junior went back to Iraq, the lefties were like, hey, just trying to make your dad proud, are ya? They should have been doing the same shit, but they missed the boat. And now if they do it, it's all because of me. Fuck them. I gave them the idea. Fuck them all hard in their nostrils. The Premier of Quebec, Robert Bourassa, and the Mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau, supported Trudeau's invocation of the War Measures Act, which limited civil liberties and granted the police far-reaching powers, allowing them to arrest and detain 497 people. The government of Quebec also requested military aid to support the civil authorities, with Canadian forces being deployed throughout Quebec. Although negotiations led to Cross's release, Laporte was murdered by the kidnappers. The crisis affected the province of Quebec, Canada, especially the metropolitan area of Montreal, and ended on December 28th. At the time, opinion polls in Quebec and throughout Canada showed widespread support for the usage of the War Measures Act. The response was criticized by prominent politicians such as René Lévesque and Tommy Douglas. After the crisis, movements that pushed for electoral votes as a means to attain autonomy and independence grew stronger. At the time, support also grew for the sovereignist political party known as Parti Québécois, which formed the provincial government in 1976. I believe Parti Québécois eventually became the Bloc Québécois, which is the French separatist party that exists in Canada. So, like a Frexit, I don't know. But they have been, in fact, they almost made up the official opposition in Parliament one election. I think it was the Liberals had won and had a wild majority, and the Bloc was, I think, like 2 seats away from being the official opposition, which is mind blowing that a single regional or single region party could ever have that many votes. But that's the way the population of Canada works, and certainly the way gerrymandering has worked, so that Quebec and Ontario have the lion's share of political power, largely because they have the lion's share of people, which makes sense, but frustrates the hell out of us in the West, who go like, yeah, but we got all this space, and we should have more representation. And I agree, but I think that representation should come from the fact that the parties should be like, hey, let's pay attention to the needs of the whole goddamn country, and not just, Ontario and Quebec and maybe the Maritimes. Who am I kidding? They don't care about the Maritimes. Anyways, back to it. So the War Measures Act got replaced by the Emergencies Act. So yes, it is the first time the Emergencies Act has ever been used. However, it is also the first time we've had something of that potential level of threat. Now, people will argue with me about that. They'll be like, yeah, this was a peaceful, they had bouncy castles. Yeah, they had bouncy castles so that they could justify having children, so that they could justify having human shields. That's a bad look. It's a real fucking bad look. The key in my mind is the Emergencies Act has limits built in. And CTV was like, "Rawr, Justin Trudeau will never give up his power." Well, I wonder what happened with that. Let's just see if there's any reference to... oh, look, there's a whole section on the Convoy protest. In the weekend before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who also serves as the finance minister, met with the CEOs of the largest Canadian banks to discuss how they could help resolve the situation. On February 14th, during the Canadian Convoy protest, the Emergencies Act was invoked for the first time in Canadian history by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government, declaring a public order emergency. Under the emergency measures regulations enacted after the declaration of emergency, participation in public assemblies that could result in a breach of peace by disrupting the movements of goods and people, interfering with the operation of critical infrastructure, or by supporting violence was prohibited. The critical infrastructure one is a huge red flag for me, because they talk about pipelines as critical infrastructure, which means that this legislation does threaten land protectors. I hope it's not used to do so, because we don't want to make this an easy thing to use, and we don't want to make this a normal thing for governments to use. But we also have to have something that we can do. It's an important distinction when land protesters are protesting. For example, the Wet'suwet'en protesting the Coastal GasLink pipeline that is going through their land. The RCMP and the local police and the government in general are pretty okay with just cracking skulls. That's like what they do. They go in, they're like, "Hey guys, let's talk about this," and the people go, "Well, yeah, we don't want this pipeline," and they go, "Well, that's too bad," and they go, "Well, we're not leaving," and they go, "Oh, okay," because that's how shit goes. Kind of a terrible thing. They have no problem stomping all over anytime it is a non-white movement. But the minute that it's a white movement, like the Convoy, all of a sudden, and you know what? You can point to the fact that there were sick people, there were, people of every ethnicity on Earth that went to this convoy. I'm sure it was a white people's movement. They had lots of people with them who were not white, but it was a white people's movement. Just facts. So when the white people do stuff, all of a sudden the government has to be real careful because that's who provides them the power of governing. You can claim in a democracy that it is all people who are equal, but I think that's a little bit of bullshit, and I think we can all just fucking agree on that. So they have to do things like this Emergencies Act or the War Measures Act or whatever, because otherwise, if you send in the RCMP and just start clubbing heads, liberals are going to be like, this is wrong. This is wrong. These people have the right to protest. Now, when indigenous people do it to prevent a gas pipeline from getting built in their environment, then it's, well, this is wrong. They need to get out of the way. That's a thing. But yeah, this is the world we live in, and I'm not gonna be able to change it. So at least not in this live stream. All right. Travel to and within places where these rallies were occurring was restricted, and foreign nationals were barred from coming to Canada to attend them. That was a key one because they were trying to drum up support from various right-wing groups in the States, which could have been really bad. The regulations also specifically outlawed the bringing of children under the age of 18 to these assemblies. The fact they had to say that is weird, right? Additionally, the use, provision, collection, and solicitation of property and funds to support the prohibited assemblies or the people participating in them was banned. This is the thing that everyone seems to be sort of primarily focused on, is the freezing of bank accounts. And yeah, I get you hear the story of like, oh, some little granny who threw $20 to the convoy and doesn't, she's not a white nationalist. She just saw people fighting for freedom and like, yeah, here's $20. Like, I feel like that is probably not the end of the world and probably shouldn't have resulted in Granny's bank account getting frozen. But Pat King, yeah. Tamaralitz, yeah. They were fundraising millions of dollars from like all over the world. That's creepy. The regulations further empower the federal government to protect critical infrastructure. Ha ha ho ho. Parliament Hill and the Parliamentary Precinct, official government residences and buildings, war monuments, and any other places that may be designated by the Minister of Public Safety. The federal government was also given the authority to compel the towing and removal of vehicles, structures, and objects used in blockades. Violations of the regulation is punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment and or a fine up to $5,000. I am Canadian. I see you have returned. Pat King loves the granny collateral damage, allows him to hide. Coward. Yeah, exactly. It's not that Pat King is like actually worried about some poor old granny. Pat King just, wants to be able to go, see, this is who they're targeting, not the guy that gave us, $350,000. It's grandmas. And it's a clever thing. It's a super fucking clever thing. Like the minute that they started fundraising, I was unsurprised they were fundraising. I mean, this is just what they do. And then I found out that the numbers, like when they hit $1 million, I was like, holy shit, what is happening? When they did United We Roll, they got like nothing. And it was a huge clusterfuck from a financial perspective. How the fuck are they fundraising? And then it hit like $7 million. And I was like, what? This makes no goddamn sense. And then you start to realize that this is, being funded internationally and that there are organizations, businesses, and whatnot that are supporting this. And they know what they're doing. So yeah, this protection of critical infrastructure really weirds me out. I 100% get it. There are things that, whether we like it or not, like pipelines that are critical to the functioning of the country. Those border crossings are critical to the functioning of the company and the economic stability of the country. 100% get that. But it's critical infrastructure is so nebulous that I get unnerved, right? When I first started encountering the words critical infrastructure, I was like related to the power grid. I used to work for an agency that was involved with the power grid, and I was like, yeah, electricity is critical infrastructure. If you take out our electrical system, you are, negatively, potentially killing people, but definitely negatively impacting people all over the place. But there's no finite name of these things are critical. So like you could say, well, sewers are critical. You have to have sewers. Can't have a protest near a sewer. Yeah, it's defined critical. It's super nasty. And the compelling of towing and removal of vehicles was something I've heard people talk about. I don't know if it's actually valid. What I'd heard, and that was that they were forcing towing companies to tow rigs, and if they didn't, they were facing fines and stuff. And that even those who, the towing companies who were part of the movement were forced to work again. Like I don't know how valid that is, but I don't like the compel is another one of those words that probably needs a little bit more clarity. Under the Emergency Measures Order, also enacted pursuant to the Declaration of Emergency, crowdfunding platforms and their payment processors were required to register with the Financial Transactions and Report Analysis Center of Canada, FINTRAC, and report large and suspicious transactions. Cryptocurrencies are also included in the expanded financial regulations. Banks were ordered to freeze personal and corporate bank accounts suspected of being used by people violating the regulations and are protected from civil liberty in enforcing the order. Or liability, sorry, civil liability. Insurance coverage for trucks being used in blockades will be suspended. Furthermore, financial institutions had to determine on a continuing basis whether any persons violating the regulations were using the services and were required to properly report findings to the RCMP or CSIS, our intelligence agency. I don't believe for a second towing companies were afraid to tow nor forced. Yeah, I feel like towing companies, there may very well have been companies that were like, no, these are our brothers and we don't want to tow them. And I just find it really hard to imagine that the government would have been like, no, you will tow that motherfucker and you will do it now. That just doesn't seem real. But again, I don't know the particulars. I've just heard that spouted and I don't really put any stock in it. So the financial thing, there's real reason to be concerned about the financing here. And it's not just because, the more money that comes in, the longer this can last. Because eventually that will just no longer be true, right? If we had not done anything, eventually people are going to stop donating millions of dollars. And as much as millions of dollars sounds like a fuck ton of money, it ain't. And it will run dry. And eventually there'll come a point where that protest is just like two guys in a Ram or a fucking F-150 going, shit. Yeah, pillow guy money. That pillow guy. Holy shit, my pillow. Let me tell you about what I'm going to do for them. I'm going to bring them pillows. Oh, fuck yeah. That'll solve everything. But yeah, the potential for, there's a lot of potential for underhanded shit. People got angry when GoFundMe shut them down, but it was because of violations of terms of service. And terms of service for GoFundMe is like, if you're making donations, and I don't know if there's a limit to this or whatever, but you have to specify who you are, especially if there's a potential political implementation or implication, of that donation. You have to specify who you are, first name, last name. And a legal first name is not Justin Trudeau's horrible wife, because that was the kinds of people that were donating $13,000, $15,000. And I'm fairly certain she wasn't doing that. Nor is she a whore. She's a fucking human being. Let's treat her like that. I love his Jesus pillows for the children. Yeah, those I want to get them just for, like throw out at a crowd in a mosh pit or something and just have them beat the shit out of each other with my pillows. Fuck Trudeau is not a compelling political platform unless it is. And you know what? Like, this is the thing that I feel like people are missing out on is fuck Trudeau is stupid because it doesn't actually involve any change. Unless you are actively saying fuck Trudeau, I demand that either he behave in this fashion or that he, leave his office or whatever. It's just, it's just fucking let's go, Brandon. Like, okay, fuck Trudeau. Who cares? This whole thing was done for reasons, and it's not because of bouncy councils. That argument drives me nuts. The announcement had varied reactions. Several provincial premiers expressed concerns, including the premiers of Alberta, my old Jason Kenney, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec. Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario, near the center of the protest, expressed support for the measure. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh supported the measure, but said that its invocation was proof of failure of leadership. Bing, bing, bing. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association criticized the invocation of the act, saying that the high and clear threshold for invocation, that the situation cannot be resolved through the regular application of existing laws had not been met, and that normalization of emergency legislation would erode democracy and civil liberties. And on this, I agree. We were unable to stop this, not because the system failed. We were unable to stop this because the cops weren't doing their job. End of fucking story. You can argue that all you like, but you know what's illegal? Honking your horn all night. That's actually not okay. We have noise ordinances that were not being followed. We have all kinds of measures that were not being met, and it was because of the fact that these are white people who have a voice. And if you had gone in and cracked skulls, you would have triggered riots by liberals. If you had said, you know what, you can't honk your horn, they'd have gone, well, yeah, I can. These were people who were there to push their agenda and to push and push and push and push and push. And eventually get a reaction, because the reaction is more important. You know how you're in junior high and there's a guy who's picking on you and he just keeps you calling you, the F slur, and you're like, God, that guy just drives me nuts. And then eventually you snap and you punch him. That was what he was looking for all along. This is the trucker protest in like Technicolor. Rhombus bouncy castles. Freedom for all bouncy castles. Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I support bouncy castles. Not so big on using your children as human shields, but I do support bouncy castles, 100%. It's a rhombus take, right? I'm not a smegma male, I'm a rhombus. Hey, something just happened. What just happened here? Oh, Lulu from Calab is now following, Lou from Calab, who I believe I know. And I see in the chat, I have two friends in Ontario who have received tickets for honking their horn at someone who wasn't pulling forward at a green light. You're telling me that blaring horns on trucks all night isn't illegal? Way to go, cops. Yeah, exactly, right? The bar that I used to work at, the previous incarnation, I don't think I ever officially worked at the third distillery, but the cops were there every fucking night with an app on their phone to detect the decibel levels to make sure that we were not in violation of the 80 decibels outside. And that was like a regular thing. That didn't happen. No one was like, they brought a fucking, like a cruise ship horn that they hooked up. Like this is easily gonna go over any existing noise ordinances. And like, didn't do nothing. The cops at Coots at the end of the big standoff were hugging and singing "O Canada" with the protesters. Like that's fucking gross. That's fucking gross. If this was homeless people, fentanyl protesters, indigenous protesters, environmental protesters, the RCMP would have boot-fucked them on day one. Yep. But this they had to treat very gingerly, because this was not about people who they can just be like, well, yeah, they're wrong. They had to, these are white people, and you have to be like, guys, let's talk. And not only that, but like, I don't know if you know this, but cops are class traitors. That is their job. They are there to protect the status quo. And what is more status quo than saying, get rid of things that are in the way of my freedoms, right? Maybe day two, after all, the cops want their Saturdays too. Yes. That was the best part of that was that meme that went out from whoever, somebody made I think it was a Twitter post, and it was like, to all of the people who are coming to Ontario, we're still under like a strict lockdown. So there will be no restaurants, there will be no hotels, there will be no bathrooms, there will be no access to any of these services. Like, you're coming, this is what you're going to get greeted by. Freedom's actually my rights. It's my right to be an asshole. And you know what? It is your right to be an asshole. It's my right to be an asshole. And I think that that's important. Or more accurately, the things that I do that make me an asshole are usually things that I'm doing that are protected by my Charter of Rights and Freedom's rights. That said, honking your horn all night, that is not free expression. That is violating. Like, we have limitations on these things for a reason. And the class trader cops didn't have any interest in enforcing these things. It's the same as like when we had our hogs marching in the anti-masker marches that we had at the start of COVID. We had that first few weeks where everybody, like, the only time you left your house was to like sing happy birthday to the frontline healthcare workers and shit, and the rest of the time you just like made sourdough and everything was good. And then people hit that point where their hair got that 1 inch too long, and all of a sudden the world was madness, and they had to fight and they had to scream and they had to argue. The anti-masker demonstrations that were happening were clearly a violation of the laws that we were operating under at that time. And yet, cops did nothing. Why? Because cops agree. And the cops get to choose what they do with the laws that they're expected to enforce, because they don't enforce them equally. And that is the whole problem. That's why the Emergency Measures Act had to be considered. When that soup kitchen was abused, it should have triggered a huge response. Still pissed at the pigs for not jumping on that. Yeah. Even before when they first showed up at the soup kitchen, the soup kitchen was like, okay, we're just gonna guess we're gonna do things, give you some food, but like we can't do this all the time. And then like later that day, they're beating up a homeless guy that bothered them, and then when a security guard stopped them, they met that security guard with the racist words. So that was cool. So this, so I agree with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association criticizing the invocation of the act, because they could have dealt with this through existing laws. They just didn't. And that became very clearly something that was not going to happen. On February 18th, it filed for judicial review of decision of the government's decision. Constitution Foundation. Did I skip? Yeah, I did. Sorry. Decision to enact the Emergencies Act, claiming the invocation was unjustified and unconstitutional. The Canadian Consultation Foundation announced intent to sue on similar grounds. On February 19th, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney also said that the province would file a court challenge to the federal government's use of the act. A few days later, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Mott said the province was also considering a court challenge. On February 20th, Edward Snowden compared the freezing of bank accounts to similar actions by the Chinese and Russian governments, and commended the Canadian Civil Liberties Canadian Civil Liberties Association for its challenge to the invocation of the act. And I don't disagree. I actually don't have a lot of faith in any of those groups. I love Snowden, but that doesn't mean he's an expert on our situations. But I think that it is important to challenge this act. Anytime it is implemented, it should be challenged and aggressively challenged for, are we doing the right thing? I have no problem with that whatsoever. Opinion polling, even if I'm in support of the act being used in a particular situation, I still think that, there's a lot of power here, and it should be subject to people questioning it. Abso-fucking-lutely. One of the first Saturdays that I'm not running around the city. Totally agreed with Jagmeet, but was still disappointed that he voted to support. Yeah, I feel I feel conflicted on that. Like I'm legitimately conflicted on the use of this because the reality is, whether we like it or not, it wasn't the democracy failing. It wasn't the leadership failing. It was the actual people on the streets, the police officers that failed us. And we had to do something, and we couldn't just react as we would if they were indigenous. We actually had to dot our T's and cross our I's, because you know white nationalists are deserving special treatment. So I don't feel like this trucker convoy is of the level of the FLQ crisis, but I do believe that it could have been. Could have been isn't really a good answer for enacting this legislation, because anything could spiral out of control. But realistically, the cops weren't doing it. The people were frustrated. Like Ontarians wanted this to be done. The cops weren't fucking there. So yeah, Coots could have been murdered RCMP, national, not local. Yeah, and it was national, and it was the longer that Coots went on, it would have spurred more similar border blockades across the country. But yeah, this was a national problem and not a regional problem. So that is 100% valid. And we talk about it like it was Ottawa because that was where the cameras were. But Coots was fucked. Coots was fucked. There were people with like AR-15s and shit and body armor, just protesting because that's how you protest. Oh no, Jim, they were just farmers, and farmers always farm their fields in body armor with white nationalist patches on it. That's a normal thing. All right. Anyways, opinion polling conducted by Maru Public Opinion showed that 66% of Canadians supported the use of the Act. Support was highest in BC, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, with 75%, 72%, and 72% of the populations in those regions supporting the invocation respectively, and with a majority in every province backing the use of the Act. So when people talk about this, they always say that like this was some totally unsupported, blah blah. No, this was exactly supported. In accordance with the requirements of the Emergencies Act, the government introduced a motion for the confirmation of the declaration of emergency on February 17th, and debate was planned to continue through the weekend with a vote scheduled to occur on February 21st. Though interrupted by police operations against the protesters on February 18th, debate otherwise proceeded as planned, and the House voted to confirm use of the Act, 185 to 151. So that was close, not like super close, but there was dissent on the decision, with the Liberals and NDP in support and the Conservatives in bloc voting against the motion. Immediately after, interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen, aka Murphy Brownshirt, who is this person who is a garbage sack of evil, filed a motion to revoke the declaration of emergency under Section 59, which would have been debated next week. Debate in the Senate began on February 22nd, with members being required to take an oath of secrecy. A vote was expected as early as that evening, but debate proved more contentious than anticipated, with several senators challenging the government to disclose the basis for invoking and continuing the state of emergency, even as blockades and protesters had been cleared. Interestingly, no one seems to go the other way on this one and go like, well, why were they so freaked out about mandates and demanding mandates been dropped where mandates were being dropped? But whatever. Prime Minister Trudeau announced that the federal government would be revoking the emergency declaration. That was February 23rd. Debate in the Senate was halted after the announcement. Later that day, the Governor General signed a proclamation revoking it. Despite its revocation, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the province of Alberta have said they will proceed with challenges to the use of the Act. So that's some history about the Emergencies Act and where it came from and how it had its ties with the FLQ crisis and all kinds of stuff like that. First off, I want to say thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Thank you to my patrons that support me on Patreon. I am a little streamer, and these people are all really awesome for supporting me. I try to put up stuff at least once a week, and I live stream every Saturday at noon Mountain Time on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, like an old man. Again, thanks for watching, and have a kick-ass day.